Welcome everybody to today's presentation, the Regional Victorian Fast Commuter Rail presentation. Again, welcome, and now it gives me much pleasure to introduce our two guest speakers for today. Our first presenter, Mr. Lucas Fraser. He's the Director of National Energy Mission Projects at Deakin University, accelerating Australia's transition to safe and efficient green energy. Well, that's where he was from 2001 to 24. He's just told me that he's involved in a startup now to commercialising some of that technology. He's the founder and principal of Juturna, an economic infrastructure strategy, origination and reform advisory to government. Our second presenter is Mr. David Downie, who is a respected figure in national economic reform with several decades of experience in the water and energy sectors in particular, having held secretary roles and similar across the Victorian public sector in energy and water. In recent years, Mr. Downie has been a strategic advisor to Deakin University, focused on economic reforms to achieve regional growth and attracting market capital to regional Australia. And I should say my name is Chris Stoltz and I'm an engineer. With all of that, I'm going to now bring up the presentation, and I'll invite Luke, thanks very much, to deliver your presentation and just tell me when to advance the slides.
Good on you. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Chris. And hello to everyone. And thank you very much to you and to Colin, Chris, for the invitation. I'll let David speak for himself in a moment, but I'm very grateful. I'm putting my railroad ports hat back on. I've had about 20 years in government and industry in that sector, in major infrastructure, and probably the last 6 or 7 in the energy and renewables asset class. So we're talking about a project which we began back in 2017, which is the second half of this presentation. The first half is trying to set a scene for you. And I think the reason we're doing that is because I was intrigued by the Engineers Australia website, particularly looking at your ethics and your values and the idea that you're trying to do something that improves the quality of life, which I think is a pretty noble aim. I think what you'll find, hopefully, the first half of this is that we make the point that that's been compromised a bit by what we've lost in terms of strategic decision-making in major projects in Australia. We're going to go into why, or at least our view of why, and that's where David comes in more than I do, because David has, well, probably getting on for 5 decades experience, David. It's hate to embarrass you, but as a former, I think maybe the last permanent secretary in Victoria, but David's of a class of people who...
One of the last, yep.
Used to do this differently, and it's really worthwhile understanding that. I know it's not maybe day-to-day engineering relevant, but very much relevant in how government and the public sector put projects in front of engineers, and you can then do your best work to best effect for that impact on life and standard of living. So just starting, I think if we just go back up one slide, Chris, that'll give you the front piece of this.
Sorry.
We're talking about major projects, so defined, you can define them any way you like. The first part of this presentation, for probably 15 minutes, it's the shorter section. We'll go into how the decision-making structures have changed. I know it's fairly imperceptible, but they have really changed. And that's causing what we believe is more risk in getting productivity, fairness and opportunity right in major projects. And, you know, to me, they're the metrics that you use. And the second half, or a bit more than half in time terms of this presentation, will go into a project which I worked on with a number of colleagues, aided by David, who midwifed this a little bit on the way through, but with regional communities and experts here and in the UK from 2017 onwards. And that's a regional rail program for Victoria, faster rail. We'll go into that in the second part. So we can jump into the next slide, Chris. Whenever you talk about major projects and you have something that's going to get recorded, you're at some peril. So let me just start by saying these are our views. They're not representing anyone we either work for or with, and we're not intending to be partisan in this. The kind of trends we're going to talk about are over 20 years old. So everyone's to blame and no one's to blame, depending on what you look at. We're not implying or criticising any particular projects of the current day. That's for later, that you can all do over a glass of wine. I'm sure you've all had experiences. And the second half of the project, the program we're going to talk about, remains a legitimate project, and the content is largely commercial in confidence. But I'll range as far as we can to explain what we've done. All right. And I'll just have David just introduce himself before we go into this, maybe, if you just want to go up a slide, Chris, and before we jump in, and then give David a chance to have a quick profile.
Thanks, Luke. I don't want to say very much at this stage, and probably what we need to say jointly, Luke and I, will come out in the discussion about how we've had unfolding a change in the way contracts, the way infrastructure has been addressed in Australia. But simply to say, I've lived through. I was Director General of Water in the late 80s, early 90s. I was Secretary of Energy and Minerals under the privatisation years of Kennett. And then I worked for a law firm where we did, for about 10 years, where we did corporatisations, privatisations. I represented major international companies. We corporatised the Snowy scheme. We did contestability regimes in energy. We purchased prisons, did all sorts of things that tested out the developing, or the way Australia was developing following the competition policy reforms of the 80s and 90s. You're probably familiar with Hawke and Keating changed the face of how we did things in Australia. And in government, we changed a lot too. Probably the most significant thing about the change that Luke was referring to in his opening comments was that in the 80s and 90s in the public service I grew up with, and I started with people like Sir Frederick Wheeler and Nugget Coombs and others as early as the 60s and 70s, I'm horrified to say. But the structure of that was really that the public service then had a very strong, capable policy capability, federally and state. There was a very clear understanding of the difference between federal and state. And there was a very good understanding between the politicians and senior public service about the respective roles and how things were approached. So, for example, was the role of the public service to spend a lot of time on developing analyses, developing policy based on data collection, serious non-political analysis, and presenting the politicians with options. That led to a lot of the major projects and reforms in Australia over that or that competition policy era and that post-competition policy era. And there were a whole lot of examples of that, the National Water Initiative, the reforms in electricity, the creation of a national electricity market, the independence of within the public sector of policy from regulation, the separation of the two, the separation of the operations and undertakings, the recognition that really was very difficult for public service utilities to deliver things in the context of the public sector governance systems. And it was probably better to get the private sector to do these things, provided governments made clear the boundaries and regulated the boundaries so that there was great clarity from government about what was expected of the private sector. And as people used to say, there's only one thing worse than a public sector monopoly, and that's a private sector monopoly. But let me just say there that it was very clear to, I think, senior public servants in Canberra, Victoria, Melbourne, Sydney, everywhere, that that structure was the way to go about things. And then that slowly began to decline in the 2000s. And when I was in my last role in the public service as head of water in Victoria during the 2000s through the drought period, there was already, through the changes in the way that public servants were employed. So, as Luke said, I was a permanent secretary once in the late 80s, early 90s, but then all of a sudden we were on 5-year contracts, and they weren't 5-year contracts, they were 1-month contracts. And the expectation was that you provided advice that the politicians wanted. Now, that happened through a whole range of steps, but that's what happened. And that meant that putting up options even was something a lot of public servants feared. because of FOI and other developments, it wasn't easy to say to a minister, there are other options, Minister. I put forward a major water project in Victoria. Leave aside the desal plant, but I put forward a major renovation of the irrigation system and a north-south pipe. And the only way to develop that was to do that with the community. You could not involve the rest of the public service in it. It would never have happened. So that situation of the 60s and 70s and policy development had changed dramatically, and it's continued to change.
Chris, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. So, David, I might jump in there. You've given it a good run-up.
Yep.
I won't. I know this is a very dense slide. I promise these first two slides are the only really dense ones that are going to be challenging, and hopefully it gets easier, it gets downhill from there. But as David said, I mean, if you want a shorthand of this, if you take it from Prime Minister Deakin Federation, pretty much to Hawke, the understanding was that in the public sector that the strategy we're applying, whether it's to major projects or other policies, was with a program of settlement. Populate or perish was the cry after the Second World War. We had a commitment to regional development, expanding out from the colonial capital city outposts. We had a lot of technical expertise in the agencies, probably less so in telco, but they all resided at the state level. And we had different mechanisms like premiers' conferences and loan councils. And as David said, the senior politicians, a different age, less media-driven, maybe less poll-driven, but you could certainly thrash things out with some common understanding of what you were trying to achieve. Once you get to Hawke and Keating and Howard, you're reacting to something else. And when there's something else, in my view, David's probably view too, you boil it down as the UK, which was really our umbilical cord to the mother country and to the way our economy, our protected economy, was set up. Once Ted Heath took the UK into the European Economic Community in 1973, that created a fundamental challenge to Australia. And so the focus, although it took a decade and the Fraser government didn't really act on anything, maybe tried, had some recalcitrant people there like John Stone, but eventually got there through the Hawke era and the Keating era in a focus on competitiveness, competition reform, domestically, global competitiveness, change in different markets, floating the dollar, tariffs, you name it. COAG then came in as a body, COAG reform payments, so little bags of mixed lollies to help the states along the way in trying to get done what needed to get done. In both of those areas, I turn to the green section. Political leaders and public sector leaders knew what they were doing. They knew that these were the goals. If you said settlement planning in the 60s and 70s, everyone understood.
Good.
If you said competition reform in the 1990s, everyone understood. Both of those systems are different focus. One's on national income growth and maximisation, the other's on more distribution. But nevertheless, they both gave you a framework, a rubric, where you could thrash out major project development and kill off good or bad ideas before they got to, a point where people are making public announcements and press releases and government are getting captured before they've done the work and thinking. And there's trying to ask that great question, which is, I know is in the UK Green book, what problem are we trying to solve? And is this the least cost way of solving it? Which is a good engineering question. And the downsides of that system, they did have downsides. You didn't get any market investment. So the capital flows from the market was shut out.
Yeah.
If you got a bad secretary who had permanent tenure and they didn't want to do anything, you're in trouble. Sometimes you get crazy things like the Albury-Wodonga Development Corporation of blessed memory, ran for about 40 years before they finally killed it off. And I think the major thing to understand is none of that was written down. What we're talking about, what David lived through, and there's some others who have a lot of age on them now that were a part of this, it wasn't written down. So if you take competition reform, basically, second law of thermodynamics, you tend to entropy. And so after about 20 years, that's not there anymore. There's no impetus for competition reform. Few people understand what it was actually about, let alone what preceded it. Okay, Chris, next slide. So what we've moved to and David can take comment on this, is we don't have settlement planning and we don't have competitiveness as rubrics to drive major projects. And nothing else has really come in that's compelling that is helping our public sectors drive this. What that means is, as in a context where the state public sectors have been stripped out of technical capability and the public policy capability that David talked about, we're relying on third-party advisories, and they've stepped happily into that space. And there's some very smart people who've superannuated out of the public sector and gone into that role. But there are differing motivations in those kind of things, which you'd all understand. And, that I think has created a more fractious environment for projects, more politicised, more public earlier. And I think the other thing I'd want to point out here is that central agencies, as opposed to previously, have pretty much for the last 15 or so years outsourced anything with the word infrastructure on it, which wasn't the word we really used before that. That's been outsourced to statutory infrastructure authorities and line agencies. I think that's a critical fault of treasuries and finance departments, is to outsource that role. That's the thinking role. That's the strategy role. Good parts about that: heaps of investment pipeline for the market, heaps of jobs. Look around the major states and look at all the people in construction, and some continuity around that out into the midterm. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, stimulus was great. Much easier to, in principle, start up a project and then take it away. Much easier than changing around taxes and other policies, in theory. The problem, as I've put in red there, is that the stimulus never left, even after the GFC ended. So it just keeps going. So the other side of that is we don't do settlement planning and we don't do national income maximisation as design priorities. We sit down and work out what to do with major projects. Projects are more expensive in real terms now. Some are into the stratosphere. I'll go into how we sit in the rest of the world in a slide ahead. And it's a bit of a hit and miss on what the socioeconomic benefits are. We don't review them post factum. And so the public loses trust in these things. Government can miss trends. They can miss emerging priorities, things they should be spending their money on and attending to in their thinking, and can actually blow up market capacity to deliver in this sort of a setting. And the regions suffer most. There is no productivity in all but the mining regions in Australia these days. So that's a really big problem. And a problem, as I said when I started this, for you as engineers, because you're now sort of at the front of the plane, whereas in previous generations, and I'll leave this to David to talk about, engineers weren't in the front of the plane. With due respect to engineers, they're great. Worked with engineers for 25 years. But you need people doing smart strategy backed by sound macroeconomic policy, and you need a sense of direction for what you want for the country to give yourself the best chance to initiate, ideate, whatever word you want to call it, projects that engineers can then deliver really smart, innovative solutions on and be really comfortable in their own skin, in that sense of, am I doing something that improves the standard of living, improves people's lives? So that's what we're aiming at. So we'll just go into a little bit more about what problems you get when you abandon that system. So next slide. And David, you can jump in here before.
Yeah, I was going to say that where we've got to now, and I can say that this is not just a view of Luke and I, but in recent times I've had a lot of conversations with ex-secretaries of premiers, treasuries, Commonwealth and state, and the general commentary on now that the current situation now is that really you've got very little policy or planning competence in most agencies. You've got a system where ministerial advisors guide the way the minister's offices work, and the ministers themselves have come in, usually, often, mostly, without any serious industry or government experience. The public service permanent heads, as they're now called, departmental heads, are appointed on supposedly 5-year contracts, but they're usually people that belong to the party of government. so that their only advice is presented within the confines of what's politically acceptable. The people underneath them can only present options that will be found politically palatable. So that, and in fact, I remember in my last year when I sent up a submission about a particular very large contract, I was rung back by the Minister's office and told to remove certain paragraphs from the departmental submission because if that submission was FOI'd, it'd make the Minister look bad. So you weren't even supposed to present the full depth or breadth of a particular argument. And that's now happening across the public service. Then by the time the private sector is engaged, it has very little structural boundaries around what's supposed to be produced. So you get the blowouts in contracts because organisational scope keeps changing, scope of the project keeps changing, political objectives out of the project keep changing. And often the projects are generated from a discussion in a minister's office on a Saturday morning. And I won't give you a big example.
We won't let David hang himself completely there. But look, I'm just
That's
conscious
what
of
happens.
time.
But I think that's a good summary of where we're at. And
Yeah.
that's what set us on a path, Luke and I, with the encouragement of the Vice Chancellor of Deakin University to think about how to approach this differently.
Yeah. So just to go very quickly on this, the higher costs are in part because when a public sector senior figure is either given a project or told about a project, or they have to go to the market immediately, right? And this is extremely well documented in the US. I'd really commend you to go and look at the New York University Marin Institute of Urban Management benchmarking. I've put the link in here, and you can read this later. But they've looked at the a couple of projects there: New York subway extensions, California high-speed rail, which is now $200 billion Australian for first phase and going like a Saturn rocket. They've found that the New York project was about 8 to 12 times more costly than projects that you would do in Europe. Europe, that is the non-Anglosphere, I would put to you, has probably kept some of these structures. The structures we talked about are still there. There are still some gates to go through around strategy and design. There's still some public sector capability, and that has helped them. That's my contention. You can look into that excellent review by Marin and see it for yourself. Next slide. Very quickly, you miss trends, right? If you don't have as Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, then any road will do. So if you look at the first one, which is the Treasury, which is the Reserve Bank target rate for interest rates, 2007-8, we've got a firestorm. We need to put some stimulus in to do things. Major projects get on foot, historically low interest rates. That's great. It's all working. Interest rates start to tick up, but nobody tells the major project world, and it keeps going. Right? That gets very, very expensive. That's what people are finding now in treasuries. Down the left-hand corner, some of you probably involved in this. In 2017, WestConnex got so complex with the Rozelle carousel underground thing that the different parties in the market had to come to the then Premier and say, look, the only way we can do this is alliance bid. So the competition's out the window, right? Now, I'm not suggesting anything nefarious. It's just that the capacity's been tapped out, and that's not a good thing for public policy. And then over to the right, that's a picture of Australia, the last 100 years of rainfall versus where we are now. We're not seeing projects come into the Murray-Darling Basin or in food bowls and things like that you would expect would be a future sort of climate resilience asset class. So we can't get off the track, pardon the pun, of what we're doing with the current system, whereas a properly constituted settlement focus or a competition focus would probably put us there in the first instance. Next slide. So this is the second half of the discussion. We set about in 2017, it was based in Geelong, where I'm based. I'd come back there after a lot of years overseas and mainly in Canberra. And the local people there, the leaders had said, look, what would we do if we could have our druthers and do something sensible? We started working on a Geelong to Melbourne fast rail program. That was based on the fact that we knew from Europe in particular, and that's the model of settlement and urbanisation that we follow in Australia. We don't follow the Asian model. We knew that the shrinking time and distance between Melbourne and regions really did work. You can look at the German and the French examples, who they have the best engineering capability to do it, and they've had the best economic impact out of it. So next slide. And the method we used, and I can say this as one of the 3 or 4 people who worked on this between here and London, in a lead sense, was we just applied what we understood of the way a public sector central agency would go about it in the first instance, right? So in days gone past. So we tried to answer the right question. So what are we trying to aim at? Well, we're trying to aim at productivity, fairness and opportunity as our goals. And the main thing we're trying to aim at is, how do you get a state settlement model that's better than the idea of Melbourne at 9 million? Melbourne at 9 million chills my blood. Right? It's not working at 5 million. And I know this, and that's no disrespect to the current government, which has done an enormous amount to deploy infrastructure to try and improve this after many years of underinvestment from both sides of government at state level. So, but how do you get a better solution than Melbourne at 9 million? If you've been to the outer suburbs of Melbourne, 50 k's out with new suburbs with no infrastructure, you really understand that problem. So we wanted to complement the works that were going on within Melbourne with something that would be smart and would bring in the broader state and take pressure off Melbourne. The way to do that is to look at European faster rail, not Japanese bullet trains, but European faster rail. We'll get into that. And then what you're trying to do is not the particular project. Rail is the vehicle, but the goal is a macroeconomic one, which is you're trying to unify the housing markets and the labour markets of regional Victoria and the capital city of Melbourne. And we're not talking about every train everywhere and every old rail track being reconstituted. We're talking about the fact that Melbourne and its radial satellite cities are really well positioned to act on this. It's a lot lower cost than trying to build out more capability in Melbourne to deal with 9 million people. These cities have been there for regional cities for 150 years. And we were just fortunate around that 2017 time. The federal and state governments at the time had agreed a design for a Melbourne Airport rail link tunnel, which we then worked on as a seamless sort of approach to making this work. It works beautifully, right? So the engineering of this would work really well with that sort of a system for most of the regional cities, not Gippsland, but the other ones.
I think it's probably worth saying at this point that we worked on a number of other projects that were also aimed at those objectives in productivity, fairness and opportunity in Victoria and Australia. There were a number of others which we haven't got time to go into here.
Yeah,
we came to the conclusion that this was one of the best things you could do, to meet those objectives across the economy of Victoria and Australia that apply elsewhere. Yeah.
So, a job continuity sort of approach for all the big projects in Melbourne, and how do you extend that? People are in those sectors. You can't just turn them off in 5 years when you cut ribbons on projects. So what are you going to do about that? And manufacturing and as I said, keeping Melbourne more livable. Next slide. And that's the context, right? So if this is just Germany as an example, but, Melbourne is just not unique in Australia, but it's very well placed for this of any state in Australia. It's got regional cities that have a history, have good infrastructure, and are comparable distances to the kind of cities that you'd expect in Europe and Germany in particular. You've got cities that are great cities. They're vibrant. They're well connected to Berlin, and they're similar distances, and they're obviously larger populations as a result. Next slide. And I think this is going to be made available, so I'm going to rush through it just so that we've got more time for questions and try and hit the main points. This is stylized, but it's trying to give you I guess the economists would look at this as the Marchetti constant, which is the idea of, very well-worn idea that people are kind of through history prepared to sort of use about an hour to travel to get to where they're going to do their daily job or hunt their wild boar or whatever it is. But, what can you do? And as you'll see, that if you look at that map, in between the red and the blue, you've got a whole lot of conurbations in regional Victoria that sit right there. So the question then is, how do you activate that? They're not activated at the moment. So next slide. And the key there is to understand where you're coming from. So if you understand the Victorian rail system and many other rail systems in Australia now, priority on operations is given to the Melbourne Suburban Rail Network. So if you're on a train from Bendigo each morning, Chris, you can go as fast as you like. And when you hit the first suburban train where you're sharing track, you are going to, the system will prioritise the suburban train and you will be behind that suburban train and it will stop everywhere. And that's the problem. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to segregate tracks that have been there for 130 years to allow them to run on an electrified 200 odd K an hour, high capacity, high frequency service straight through to Southern Cross. The Melbourne Airport Rail Link Tunnel gives you that. And that's what we found in our preliminary design. So this is an in-corridor refit. We're not talking about a bullet train. We don't need to redesign a whole lot of networks. Those things are, for our purposes, for Australia's purposes in this context, for regional development, they may as well be a space shuttle. They're a completely different design. They're incredibly orders of magnitude more expensive. They need different alignments. The tolerances are much closer for everything they do. So you're not talking housing buybacks, you're not talking greenfield, alignments, you're talking just in-corridor refit for the most part. And for the most part is really for the 90+% most part. We're not doing trains everywhere, as you saw from that previous slide. We're really just talking about the major regional capitals. And everything is going by that Melbourne Airport Rail Link project and tunnel, except Gippsland. Gippsland you've got to do differently, and Gippsland is more complex now from 2017. I'll get to that later probably. Part of the beauty of this system is that all those regions would gain direct access to rail to the Melbourne Airport. And we included in the design I think it ended up at about 20 new stations built into suburban line duplications, because to segregate some of the rail, you actually have to quad track, and there's space for doing that, but you have to actually go and build out a second track. So you've got that electrified faster rail segregated, and that means giving suburban rail more stations and giving it its own track. Fleet and electrification systems were looked at and put into the business case. The model of funding this and the model of running it, the procurement model is completely different. Some of that we won't go into because that's, I guess, still commercial in confidence, but there is a very reliable way to do this. Commonwealth can fund it. They can asset recycle into the market once it's up and running, and that creates a very effective system fiscally. You don't need the kind of property value capture on everyone's house that is sometimes talked about, and we see in other jurisdictions overseas.
Yeah.
But you are able to deploy it to stop property developers getting super profits out of these things, which is a big problem with any faster rail or any rail project, frankly. And as we said, probably about 10,000 jobs a year, and that gives you that continuity out of a lot of big urban projects in Melbourne, which are coming offline in years ahead. David, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's good. I think that what underpins that design flowed in part really from the economic objectives that were set for this, and it was the boundary set by how do we get a cost benefit analysis that ends up positive so that the productivity goal is met. That's why this works.
I think the other thing
really is productivity.
Yeah, and the important thing to point out here is that we were true to the model that would have been done 30 years ago, perhaps.
Yeah.
By that I mean that we weren't doing any of this and presenting it and hawking it before this was done. So before those systems were tested, we didn't tell anyone, right? And that's the important point. You shouldn't go into a project and announce it and hope to find out about it later. The work years ago, decades past, would have been done, at least in a preliminary sense, to give governments confidence to move down a path. That's the approach we tried to follow. Next slide. That goes to integrity. As I said, we threshold tested these things. We were very grateful for support from a lot of people who got around it and felt that it was the right thing to do, and they gave a lot of free time to it. The local governments in the regions, Ballarat, Geelong, Bendigo, Shepparton, put money into it. You can do a lot on a little. But so they were in good faith working as much as they could, and some industry parties. We were very grateful, and I think John Hirsch is here today somewhere. The Rail Futures Institute was commissioned to do some initial work with Geelong, and then very kindly stayed with in-kind support, and at a couple of points managed to tip some of our numbers towards government quantitative surveyors, who very kindly gave a green light to some things and gave us confidence that we had fidelity of costings. So there are holes in this. We're quite upfront about that. We did approach a lot of eminent urban planners in Victoria. They won't want to be named, but they were very good in keeping us in the left and right of arc on what we should be aiming for, as well as people overseas. So we developed new timetables, uplift, passenger capacity, all those sort of things, making sure that it works, that it doesn't compromise things, that we don't have showstoppers in this that we're selling to government on false pretenses. So that's where we got. We use that approach. Next slide. These are the impacts. So with the last bit of money that the local governments had, we advised them to go and get the best Treasury grade economic modelling in Australia done on this, which very kindly Peter Brain at the National Institute of Economic and Industry Research did. I think for the work he ended up doing, he probably needed to put another nought on the invoice, but we got away with it. A fine piece of work. You can still find it on the NIA website. And what that tells you, and Peter, I've quoted a little bit later, is the first to admit it's not a complete study, but it is a good Treasury grade preliminary study, and a couple of 100 pages of hardcore economics. You're welcome to get into it on the link. But the impact is there. We're looking at a long run 5% growth in the state economy above business as usual, better than 10% rate of return on the project, generating, depending on what discount rate you use, and he and other experts have suggested for this sort of project you'd be using 3.5%, about, the best part of, $500 billion worth of growth on the economy. And that's a snapshot taken 10 years after the project's fully in place. Now, Gippsland is really, really dicey for reasons we'll go into at the end. So you'd need to redo that and recalibrate it a bit potentially.
Yeah.
But what it does do is it raises state productivity very reliably by doing what it says on the tin, which is improving and unifying the labour markets and the housing markets between those regional cities and Melbourne, and encouraging growth. Bendigo and Ballarat corridors benefit the most. They're above 20% growth, above trend. Estimated about 30 billion in Melbourne road traffic congestion saving. Obviously carbon savings and safety impacts, that's all remains unmodelled. And Peter and his colleagues, John Stanley and others, did this modelling in the teeth of COVID. We all did this remotely. And so it was pretty dark at that time. So one of the quaint features of this is that it was there was no population growth actually estimated in the model, just because we didn't know what was going to happen with the world. As soon as you put population growth of any description into this, the growth improves enormously out of the outcomes. And you've got to remember that pre-COVID, Melbourne was on a population growth of above 2%, which is higher than any major capital Western city in the world at that point, and unsustainable, I'd argue. So, I don't know what the growth rates are at the moment. I haven't checked, but rerunning this model on current growth rates is going to improve the pot. And again, everyone's better off under this model, depending on where you live. Better off in different ways, and the NIA report goes into that in some depth. Next slide. That's just one of the pictures of modelling. They do this at SA2 level, which is an economic modelling idea of the level of granularity. That's about the lowest level you get to. Sort of equates to local government areas. But that's showing you, the dark green is showing you above 7.5% productivity gain above trend. And you can see that wherever you lie one of these radial networks and you connect the housing and labour markets with Melbourne, you get much more growth. Our design actually goes out the back of Geelong into Colac and Winchelsea in that area. The reason is because just understanding Victoria, You can't fit a limitless amount of people in Bendigo and Ballarat. It's just not the country for it. Out the back of Geelong is you can go as far as you want. It's an enormous capacity to take more people. Very, very accepting of that in terms of the layout. So that's a picture of the kind of impacts you're getting out of this system. As I said, all of this done under that model that we used to work under probably 20, 30 years ago that a central agency would be doing or a transport agency would be doing before you go and commission engineering studies, right? That's how you end up with projects that give you a fair shake at giving you productivity, fairness, and opportunity. Next slide. I've left this and you're going to get access to this presentation. So these are some independent expert reviews. We wanted to have these here because they carry a lot of weight and obviously for doing something outside of government, this was always going to swim upstream. We knew we would come against headwinds in the status quo, put it mildly. So, Peter's point is it's not a complete assessment. He's the first he's the doyen of economic modelers in Australia. He's been doing it for 40 years. Every single Prime Minister and Premier probably has used Peter and his network and his institution. And as he says, if you've got a project that's going to give you a long run 5% increase in state product, a 10% project rate of return, and a reduction in regional inequality, you can't throw it out. Next slide. Please, Chris. It's Chris Nash we went to. Chris is maybe known to some of you, but Chris is really one of the foremost figures in world faster rail. He's got some of his credentials there. Incredibly learned figure, very nice man, and he was gracious enough to independently review this, and you can see his some of his comments there, which, echoing what they're trying to do with the Northern Powerhouse program in rail in England, which has fallen on some harder times fiscally. But it is the right approach. And he reviewed our business case. And I think the comment that it would be good value for money to do it double the cost. Or we were pretty generous in our estimates on contingency and pretty close on our costings in any event. So we were pretty much buoyed by that. And then the next one was our last independent expert review to leave you with, Chris, if you would. And that's Dr. Michael Keating, a mentor of mine, a great man, another Geelong boy. And he was head of Prime Minister and Cabinet under Keating and the first Howard administration. Done a lot of these sort of roles and really led the competition reforms, David would know. And his view is, you can read for yourself, but he's seen a lot of this sort of stuff over 40 plus years, 50 years. They generally don't work because they don't evaluate in advance what they're trying to achieve. They don't consult local communities. And we still are where we are economically, with the regions having no productivity and no growth, and capital cities being overburdened and getting very expensive in terms of infrastructure solutions. And that this project, as he saw it, was a clear and worthwhile, solution to a macroeconomic end, rather than just another big expensive rail project. So that was music to our ears to hear that, and that's how we've tried to then take the thing forward. So, last slide, and I can get out of everyone's hair, and you can ask questions. But I want David really to throw to David on this. But the points I sort of made here was that if you wanted to do something differently at a federal or a state level and start thinking about this, I think it is really worth reclaiming some of what the public sector used to be good at in this space, getting a better understanding for the people who are in those senior positions now, who are, maybe in their 40s and their 50s, and understanding what that role was. You can't go back to first principles. I think you need to be practical. I think trying to take some of the current project selection we've got in the pipeline and start thinking about how we can cant them a bit towards better outcomes would be a sensible approach, rather than trying to start from first principle. There's just too much at stake in the market in terms of investment, in terms of the labour market, to just change horses. So we need integration of better ideas over time. And we need to also, I think, at the same time, make sure we've got the cold towel, and it would behoove the Commonwealth to do some work on what the long-term cost is of just remaining in this kind of vacuum where each government comes in and makes a few statements, headline statements about what it wants to do, doesn't really flow down to any structural kind of appreciation of how you're putting these major projects together before it gets to engineering solutions, or at least at an early stage. So they're my thoughts. So I'd really leave David as the senior party here to give you a few thoughts before questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I just very quickly, given the extent of what Lucas said in my previous comments, the challenge is to find a method of looking at what Australia's issues are and coming up with the solutions that in priority order that would achieve the best outcomes in terms of that productivity. I noticed that Chalmers in the first speech after the election win mentioned the word productivity for the first time that I'd heard in the election context. And that's just been absolutely ignored. I don't know how we're going to get governments and the private sector to work together to find a process that would better target what is going to improve the outcomes for the Australian economy. But I'm very much in fear that we are headed for a cliff at the moment. When my last few years in government and the work I've done around projects, not only Luke and I on this one, but we've done other projects which would be very large infrastructure projects for governments. I won't mention them here now, but all the times that we had discussions around those, it was very clear that the thinking was around how do we maintain our votes in the marginal seats. It was never about how we find infrastructure projects that will generate the best outcomes overall for the Australian population. So I don't know how we do that. I'd like to think, as Lucas said, that we return to the same approach that we used 20, 30, 40 years ago. That would need major changes in the way the politicians go about it, need major changes in the way the public sector's built, and it would need major changes in the way the private sector works. So
one thing I will add, David, is one thing I will add is the only way you're going to get it done, and I'm absolutely certain about this with my 25 to 30 years of experience now, is you have to deliver a project, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to write policy about this. Too many people against it.
Yeah.
You have to get a champion of a project. You need to show that project needs to deliver and give faith to the political class and the public sector class and the market that these things work. Once you've got one, you've got a basis for having a strategy and policy discussion. But you need that winner, you need that poster boy to make a change.
I think I'd finish on the note that what we tried to do and what I tried to do in government towards the end was avoid involving the other instruments of government and the politicians in project development. So we had a major project in the north of Victoria, $2.5 billion renovation of the irrigation system. We didn't bring that into government until we had the local communities totally on side, and even then, that became a subject of political interference. In this project that we're talking about now, it was through the support of local communities who understood as much as anyone about what was needed in their areas that led to developing and fleshing out this project concept. To the other major projects that we believe should be endorsed and revisited by governments, it's the same thing. If those local communities don't support it and have the political power to bring them on the agenda, they're just not going to happen. But that's the only solution I can find, have the local communities strongly supporting the project. They're intimidated. In this project, they're intimidated into not offering too much support because of the political systems.
Thanks, David, and thanks very much, Luke, as well. Terrific presentation, and we've got 10 minutes left for some questions. And I might suggest to both of you that let's see if we can find some quick answers that concentrate on the point, so we can get through all the questions. The first question there is: any costings on these? On these?
Yeah, there's some costings in the original one. You're looking at, if you're 2025 the dollars and you leave out Gippsland, you're looking at about 100 billion for the entire project. Bear in mind two things. The economic return is out of this world. So as my mentor, Michael Keating, would always say, I don't care what money I spend as long as I get a good return. If I don't get a good return, I don't want to spend any money. right? Much of that money is chewed up by the front end by the Melbourne Airport railing interface. So that's there anyway, and that's actually already committed by government, right? So it gets cheaper, and then you're really just adding radials on. Gippsland's a problem, and I noticed a comment just passing by, and John Hirsch is here. I know better to talk about it, but Skyrail in the southeast of Melbourne took out the last alignment for quad tracking. So we're in the land of the mole people at this point in having to go underground for a fair way to get out to Warragul. And that's a real tragedy. Just costs more money. Not to say you can't do it, and you can see the modelling. I mean, the impact on as a structural transition for the Gippsland economy is enormous. But yeah, you would certainly start with your Bendigo, Ballarat, and Geelong, and that may give you the impetus to then look at that as a larger project in the longer term. But yeah, we won't go into too much detail, obviously, because this is a live project. Potentially, if the government picks it up, we've got people here and overseas interested in having a real stab at it. But I think you can have some confidence that we're pretty good on our costings. We're very generous on our contingencies. Not overly so, not crazy so, but yeah, we're pretty comfortable. So the main thing is, does it create an economic benefit? And I think we've done the work at the right end to say yes, it creates enormous economic benefit.
Terrific. And I notice the next question is about single or duplicated lines. When they upgraded Bendigo, I don't know, at Brumby's time, I think, they went from dual lines to single lines. So this is the modelling would be that you have dual lines.
Yeah, we've got around a lot of it without going into it. If John wants to come on, he's more than welcome to. He's across things. If you want to unmute John, but yeah, I mean, we can get around some of these problems, and some of them don't need a lot of extra work to duplicate. So I guess the mantra we've been on with the velocities, which is for those who don't know, the current diesel fast trains that have been there for a while. They've been running on the same 130-year philosophy of we'll just keep getting faster as we can on existing alignments. We haven't really thought about the segregation issue so much. As soon as you start thinking about that, you realise that it's actually not that far off and economically very much worth doing.
Okay, there's a question here. I don't know that I understand, but I read the Southern Cross to Tullamarine to Shepparton, I believe, should be looked at as HSR continued on to Albury. Thoughts, please.
I know that the current Commonwealth government has a mandate or has a program of Brisbane to Melbourne. It's true that you could look at that system as the linkage. I don't know whether you go to Shep or you come back up through the Wang Albury Wodonga line. Don't know why you detour to Shep. But yes, you could look at that. The question is, as I said, this is not a intercontinental fast rail project.
No.
Right? This, as I said, if you go back to what we're trying to achieve, productivity uplift, fairness and opportunity uplift, and that's reflecting the fact that the states, and Victoria in this case, in economic terms, trade much more with themselves than they do interstate. Right, so you're not going to get a huge economic uplift from people travelling on a train. Well, you're in competition with the aviation sector at that point, to some extent. The bigger gain is by the settlement planning and linking the urban and the labour and the housing markets with the regions, as we've proven with the NIA modelling. So that's been our focus, and that leads you to the 200 odd kilometre French or German systems, the Regios in France, that sort of a system. So
the Wollongongs and the Newcastles and the Gold Coast and the Southern Cross, not Brisbane to Melbourne.
yeah, we have also done a design for Sydney and Newcastle and Wollongong. You'd be happy to know. So we haven't modelled that economically, but that would be easy to do. And yeah, fair to say it's a little bit different than what people are thinking of at the moment. And as I said, same principles apply there as they would in Brisbane out to Ipswich and up and down the coasts.
Terrific. There's a couple of questions about Gippsland there, but I think you answered those earlier, Luke. And if anyone's got any comments or further questions, we will be making this presentation available. And also, Colin has indicated he'd like to hear any feedback, and his email is ingeostsociety@bigpond.com. So, Luke and David, thank you very much for your time today and the very detailed and interesting presentation. I really like the segregation into the settler versus the economic growth, economic development comparison compared to the political pork barreling that goes on, and the role of engineers coming after there's a business case.
You might say that, I can't possibly comment.
Oh, I can, yeah.
Yeah,
So
no,
thanks.
but I'd agree with you, Chris, because
Yeah.
I don't feel
So-
I owe anyone anything anymore. I think it's time for some plain speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So if we could all clap, we would. So thank you again, Luke, and thank you all for your attendance today. And I look forward to the next seminar in this series.
Great.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
everybody.
Pleasure. Thank you for
Thanks.
the invitation.
Thank you
Go
for
well,
the
everyone.
invitation. Yeah.
Luke
Thank
and
you.
David, thank you